Our society often represents sexual assault in a really stereotypical way, and it draws on a lot of harmful stereotypes about gender and sexuality, like the idea that men are always the creepy perpetrators, or that only women can be sexually assaulted because they do things that make themselves vulnerable, like walk alone or drinking. Many of us understand that these are myths and that they're simply not true, but maybe we don't fully understand why they're not true or how to explain that to other people. So let's look at some of the most prevalent myths about sexual assault and unpack them a little.
As we touched on when we talked about our society's stereotypical depiction of sexual assault, the media usually shows males as the ones who commit sexual assault, or perpetrators, and females as the ones who are sexually assaulted, or survivors. What we don't often see representations of in the media are men who have experienced sexual assault, even though recent statistics show that 1 in 6 Canadian men will experience sexual assault at some point in their lives. Unfortunately, there are lots of stereotypes about men and masculinity that make it harder for some people to believe that a male could be sexually assaulted. There's definitely this idea in our society that men are supposed to be big and strong, so they should be able to protect themselves. But we know that men come in all shapes, sizes, and abilities, and they, just like anyone else, can't always protect themselves. It could be because the other person is bigger and stronger than them, or because something like coercion was used. There's also this notion that men are always ready to go, and they always want to have sex. Of course, we know that everybody has different libidos, and no one wants to have sex all the time. I mean, we still need time to do things like sleep and eat. And even if somebody did have a higher sex drive, that person still has the right to choose if, when, and with whom they had sex.
As you can imagine, these stereotypes can make it really confusing for a survivor who identifies as male to define their experience. It can make it a lot harder for them to reach out for support and to understand what happened to them. And the result is that as a society, we don't always know that men can be survivors because it's something we don't hear about very often. So when talking about sexual assault, it's really important to recognize that people of all genders can experience sexual assault and people of all genders can commit sexual assault.
When we look at male experiences of sexual assault, although there are female perpetrators, studies show that around 87% of perpetrators are actually males. And a lot of people think that these male perpetrators against males must be gay because there's this idea that sexual assault is about sex or sexual attraction. But in reality, the majority of those perpetrators actually identify as heterosexual.
Which brings us to our next myth, that sexual assault is motivated by sex. In reality, sexual assault is actually motivated by power and control, not sex. Let's look at this idea a little more closely. Imagine someone is wearing a baseball uniform and they have a baseball bat. And to anyone on the outside, it probably looks like they're about to go play baseball, right? But if they were to take the baseball bat and hit someone over the head with it, would you say they were playing baseball? No, right? In this context, a baseball bat can be used to play a fun game of baseball or as a tool to assault someone, just as sexual activity can be used to have a consensual sexual experience or as a tool to assault someone. In this way, sex is simply the tool chosen by the perpetrator to get power.
Probably the next most common myth about acquaintance sexual assault is that it happens because of some sort of miscommunication. What we mean by that is that even though we can all recognize a lot of different ways that someone can communicate no, whether it's by changing the subject or trying to keep their clothes on, there's still this idea that if a survivor had just more clearly communicated no by yelling no or by fighting back, that the sexual assault wouldn't have happened. And this is one of those misconceptions or myths that, because it is so common in our society, it can be really helpful to look at it in just a completely different context.
Imagine if someone was hiking in the woods and came around a corner to find a big grizzly bear standing on the trail. In that situation, the hiker might have any number of reactions: crying, screaming, maybe running away. They might try to fight the bear or freeze. But if anyone was looking in on the hiker being confronted by this bear, no one would think, "Wow, that hiker totally wants this to be happening right now." Of course not, right? Although that was a silly example, sexual assault is a similarly unexpected and shocking event, and people react in many of the same ways they would if they were to run into a bear in the woods. Some people cry, scream, or fight, while others may totally freeze. But it doesn't matter what they did, because all of these reactions just as clearly communicate no, because no one would mistake any of them for, I want this to be happening right now. We want to be really clear. There is no miscommunication in sexual assault. Studies have shown that survivors always communicate some form of no in a sexual assault situation. And all of us are aware when the person we are with does not want to engage in sexual activity or wants to stop, regardless of whether they verbally say the word no or not. The difference between people who do commit sexual assault and people who don't is that those who don't see the cues indicating no and they stop, whereas people who do commit sexual assault see the same cues and continue anyway to gain that feeling of power and control.
When people think about what sexual assault means, they often think of no means no. What no means no implies is that until we say no, people have a right of access to our bodies. In Canadian law, we actually have an affirmative consent standard, and what this means is best captured by the phrase, only yes means yes. Just to give you one example, if I were to go to a party tonight, I wouldn't go up to all of the guests and say, I don't want to have sex with you tonight. I don't want to have sex with you tonight. People would think that was absolutely ridiculous. We are not walking yeses until we say no. Instead, we're walking no's until we give some indication that we want to have sex. So what affirmative consent really means is that each one of us is responsible before, during, throughout any sexual activity for ensuring that our partners are actually agreeing.
The most important thing to remember about communication and sexual assault is that anything that isn't a clear voluntary yes is a no, which we're sure you'd agree is pretty simple. But throw a little alcohol into the mix, and sometimes people feel like it gets a bit more complicated than that. So let's talk about alcohol and sexual assault, because there are a lot of myths that go along with that topic. The main thing to understand is that there's a clear difference between drunk consensual sex and sexual assault involving alcohol. In drunk consensual sex, the people involved are willingly and actively participating. It may not be the best sex they've ever had, it may be kind of sloppy, but it's not sexual assault. In sexual assault involving alcohol, however, there are two general situations that tend to take place. In one, the person is not actively participating and will be showing some form of non-consent. The other situation is when one person is too drunk to give consent. This might involve someone slurring their words, maybe stumbling around, or passing in and out of consciousness. Whatever cues they're giving you, it's going to be clear they aren't able to do much of anything, much less consent to sexual activity.
So at the end of the day, it's our responsibility to ensure that our partners are capable of consenting. And if we're ever unsure if someone is too drunk to consent, the best thing to do is just to wait. Wait until that person is sober. Give them your number. If someone does have sexual contact with someone who is highly intoxicated and therefore unable to consent, that person is committing a sexual assault.
All right, so we may know that someone who's highly intoxicated can't consent to sexual activity, but a lot of people believe the myth that if a person is sexually assaulted when they're drinking or drunk, they're at least somewhat responsible for what happens. Although this is a common belief, it's simply not true. The fact is, we're all responsible for what we do when we're drunk, not what's done to us. For example, if a person goes to a party and gets drunk, they're responsible if they lose their phone or wallet, if they spill a drink on someone, and if as they're leaving, they trip going down the stairs and hurt their knee, then they are responsible for that. But at the same party, if he or she is heading down the stairs and their friend sticks out their foot and trips them, then that's their friend's fault, right? That's something that they did to someone else. In the same way, survivors are not responsible for being sexually assaulted, even if they've been drinking. We are each responsible for what we do, not for what is done to us.